at the time of Joshua, there was no Jericho standing. So there's doesn't mean the story can't teach us something, but
Interesting.
okay.
Yeah, yeah. Dr. Pytlik, in the last three segments, as we were talking about the history of the Jewish people, going back to the original name that was one of the earlier names that was used for them, Yehud, you made many references to the Bible.
Mhm.
What I'm wondering is how much of the stories in the Bible about the Jewish people, because that's what we're talking about now, are myth, and how much of them are real? This does this make your work as an archaeologist difficult?
It's a really good question. So there are several schools of thought about this. You can imagine.
Hmm.
There are people who are more on the what we call the maximalist side of things.
What does
Uh,
that mean,
so
maximalist?
the Bible says such and such happened here, this event, this person did this at this event, this type of thing. And so an archaeologist who might be a maximalist might say that's the Bible says so. But it leads us to a problem called circular reasoning. Okay. This was really a pitfall in the early days of archaeology, before the methods were really refined of dating and things like this. Archaeology is concerned with a lot of things, but when, how, and who are some of the questions.
Yeah.
Bible is interested in a different thing, and it's not an archaeological source book. It's a story of legends, and it's a story of theology, and it's a story of stories and families and wars and all kinds of stuff. Um, so the problem with circular reasoning, say, for example, a site we probably have all heard of, is Jericho.
Yeah. Yeah.
So early on, the idea was that the Bible, most people thought, say at the early beginning of the 20th century, 19th century, in that time frame, that the Bible was, it says what it says, it's true. And so when we hear this, we read the stories about, Joshua marching around Jericho and the walls fell down and all that stuff. Well, okay, an archaeologist would say, even today, maybe, well, if that is true, then we should find an evidence of destruction and the walls falling down or something like this. So they went
Yeah.
into Jericho with this Bible story in mind early on. And they dug around and they said, well, you can see it when something collapses and you can see destruction layers. And so they came to a destruction layer, and this is a simplified story. Here's the evidence of Joshua's conquest. This also occurred at places like Troy. Schliemann did the same sort of thing there, except when Schliemann found a destruction layer, it was 2,000 years earlier than the time of the Trojan War.
But he was not a trained archaeologist, right?
Right. He was a passionate historian in the Iliad and the Odyssey and was just fascinated with this story. So
Interesting.
circular reasoning can be a real problem. Now, that's a maximalist. Bible says
So
what it
to just finish the Jericho story, were
Yeah,
the destroyed walls from a different era
they
in
were
the Bible?
from a much different era. So
Okay.
Kathleen Kenyon comes along in the 1950s and says, I'll fix this story. I'll tell you. And she was well versed in biblical history and all that stuff, but she was a great archaeologist. And the methods were much better. And she said, sorry, world, when I did this, the dating doesn't match up. So what she claimed was, at that point, she published this, and it was in the press and everything at the time. I'm sorry to say, people, that we've done this work with these methods and so on, and that at the time of Joshua, there was no Jericho standing. So there's doesn't mean the story can't teach us something, but
Interesting.
okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, a minimalist would say archaeology only. It's the only witness to history. That's Bible doesn't is later. It's full of stories. Doesn't apply here. It's not history. That's a minimalist. A moderate, of course, everybody says they're a moderate. Today, is that the Bible is a tool, as are Assyrian inscriptions and Egyptian inscriptions. So what's interesting about this is that we're in the realm of history when we're talking about texts outside the Bible, but we're in the area of myth when we're talking about the Bible for some people. So what is it? Which one is it? So for example, one of the more famous inscriptions, some of the most famous inscriptions are extra biblical, means they're found outside the Bible. And they can really corroborate some great historical stuff. Like we have two inscriptions about mentioning the house of David. This was,
Ah,
this was earth shattering when these came out, because everybody said over here with the Bible, you can't use it. And by the way, there's no fortified cities, there's no literacy at this time. Well, we proved all that wrong. We have this in the archaeology. But then when the Aramean king says, I defeated these kings, so and so and so and so, from the house of David, it's not in the Bible. It's an inscription over there from the kingdom of Aram. And okay, so what do we do with this? Now, we also have one much earlier from Egyptian sources.
yeah.
They claim there that the Pharaoh Merneptah says, I destroyed a people called Israel. So here's the thing about texts. They're just as, they have to be as interpreted as anything else.
It could be unreliable, self-serving. Is
Yeah,
that what?
I've heard in my own college, we have history over there, we have archaeology over here, and I've heard some of the historians say, oh, archaeology, it's all interpretation, as if text are the same thing, right?
Yeah. So I take it that in this wide spectrum from maximalist to minimalist, you are a true moderate.
Of course.
Of course, there you go. Point of clarification. In a prior segment, you said archaeology in Jerusalem is very difficult. Is that because of ethnic and political tensions, or is it just because it's a big city, it's hard to dig? It would be hard to do archaeology in middle of San Francisco.
Right. So exactly. So yesterday, as a matter of fact, in a class, I said, let's use the analogy. We're talking about the very same thing, the very same topic. And I said, imagine, because we're in the Detroit area, I said to the class, can you imagine you're given the task to go to Metro Detroit and find evidence of the French, occupation or French presence in the city of Detroit? Where are you going to go?
Start digging streets, pavement. I see.
So that's the problem. Number one, it's urbanized, and it has been for thousands of years. It's also politically charged, of course. It's got three, at least, great religions who have different ways of interpreting the value of archaeology.
Yeah.
So certain parts are off limits. Certain parts are, welcome, come dig, because the more you tell us, the more it helps us with telling a historical story. So there's different viewpoints on this. And there's also, modern political problems. Of course, archaeology's involved in these, whether we want to be or not.
Yeah. In a way, archaeology is politicized in these contexts as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So it just depends on how one views the role of archaeology and whose interpretations you can believe. Can you imagine trying to explain, if you're a practicing something or another and you're trying to dig up their history? I mean, it just gets very complicated.
Yeah. Do you have any lessons, takeaways for our audience? We talked about an hour about the history of the Jewish people, and we went really far. We stayed away from all the politics and events that are occurring now.
Takeaways, I don't know if I have any brilliant points takeaways. I think that what's really fascinating is that we should also keep an eye on the fact that for good long periods of time there was cooperation, there was cohabitation, there was interchange of ideas. And I think some of the lessons of history, including the Middle Ages, when they are talking about commonalities among three great faiths, and in the Near East, two great faiths, Judaism and Islam, they are really getting on together with talking about ideas. And I have experienced that myself in the Detroit area when I work with interfaith groups for the Jewish-Muslim dialogue. When we talked about our common stories, it changed the entire environment. And then we could start to be safe in that environment.
Do you also talk to this interfaith exchange? Does it take place in difficult times such as ours now as well?
it becomes a little bit more guarded for sure.
Yeah.
But it's also important to keep this going. And when we start to look at the stories that we have different inflections, we can say your story says this and our story says this, and then we can see how they match or how they don't, or what's interesting to learn over here. I think, it's really a tragic thing if we just look at the negative.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to right now.
Yeah.
So, I think there's some great lessons about not only that, but just the resiliency of people.
For
They didn't
sure.
they didn't have a grand government in these pre-modern periods to help them. They are extremely knowledgeable. They're extremely skilled. And I'm not just talking Jews, and I'm talking about everybody in this period because they
Hmm.
had to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was no UN or no great powers from North America or Europe or whatever, Far East, come in to help and intervene, perhaps.
And one last thing I would say is if we think we know, we probably don't. So I think we need to also allow each other great leeway, and also, sift through this stuff and see what really is relevant and not sensationalized.
That's wonderful. Dr. Pytlik, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so much, Dr. Pytlik.
Thank you so much.